Good morning, everybody. I'll just wait for the numbers to get up slightly. I won't keep you all waiting too long. Let's just wait for a few more people to join and then we can get going. So we'll just wait a couple more minutes and then we'll start. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes, as I said just before, just wait for the numbers to get up. So we'll be ready to go in a couple of minutes. So if you can just bear with me and then we'll make a start. Many thanks. Okay, I think we'll make a start, so I don't want to keep everyone waiting this morning. Many thanks for joining this webinar. I'm Catherine Ramsay and I'm a partner at Gannon's and I specialise in employee equity. And the topic of the webinar today is what can you do when EMI is not the answer? So the agenda for this morning is we're going to first of all look at just why use a share plan. This is a topic I've covered many times, but it is useful to remind ourselves why a business would look to implement a share plan generally. Then want to move on to when EMI is not the answer. EMI being the Enterprise Management Incentive Plan, which there is no doubt is the most popular type of share plan. However, it isn't always appropriate for a company. And often practitioners focus on EMI, and the purpose of this morning is to look at the alternatives. And that then brings us into those alternatives. The first one being growth shares, which are probably the most popular alternative to EMI. And I'll be focusing mainly on growth shares. But we are also going to look at the JSOP, which is the Joint Share Ownership Plan, which is another alternative and not too dissimilar to growth shares, but a few fundamental differences, which we'll run through. I then want to address funding. Obviously, that's key for private companies and also key to how some of these plans are implemented. How can people afford to buy in and how can companies afford to make it happen? So funding is very important. I then want to look briefly at levers. When we design share plans, there are many considerations, but probably the biggest design point is making sure that if people leave a plan that's been implemented, what are the considerations around that and how can the company make sure that any shares are taken back and at what price? They're going to finish with a case study, a practical example of a case that we've done at Gannon's, and it implements all of what we've looked at throughout the webinar and hopefully ties things up nicely. There'll then be a chance for Q&A. Please do use the Q&A function or the chat function during this webinar, and I'll endeavour to answer as we go along, or I'll hopefully leave some time at the end for any questions. So if we get started, why use a share plan? Well, it's a key element for retention and recruitment. And in the market now, it's expected from many key players. So individuals who are looking to companies for their remuneration package will expect almost 3 layers to their pay. There's the base pay, which might be your monthly pay, which will help with things like mortgage payments and general outgoings. So there might be some element of an annual bonus that might help with a new car or holidays. But then there's the long-term element, which is almost the long-term, so it's deferred but it's there for the future, almost as a pension pot almost. So it's there to keep people in a business and look long term, to align them with shareholders fundamentally and get them to think in longer term. Now, this is incredibly important as a recruitment and a retention tool. And I think if we look at the 2008 financial crisis, one of the things that came out of that was that the financial sector was mandated by the government to have at least 2/3 of some pay put into some deferred element. And that was to try and create stability in the market. So if we fast forward to today in 2022, where arguably we have volatile times, how can you stabilize your workforce? How can you get them all thinking in the same direction? And one way is that deferred pay element that will stop somebody potentially leaving your company and going elsewhere because they've got some skin in the game, as we call it, and something to lose. Whereas a cash pay doesn't necessarily breed loyalty, and people can move between companies or use that as a benchmark for a future employer. The element of deferred pay, be it an option or a share, does help future-proof against that somewhat. Tax efficiency is another reason why people use share plans. Whilst there's nothing wrong with cash, it does come with a high tax rate, national insurance and income tax. Whereas what a lot of share plans are looking to do is move away from the income tax and national insurance element and try and move people into a capital gains tax net. Employment related securities I've put there on the slides, and I don't want to make this too technical this webinar, but it's essentially the starting point for HMRC is any way you try and pay a member of your workforce, be it through shares or cash, they'll see that as remuneration and try and tax it as such, i.e. income tax and national insurance. But there are ways around that, which we'll look at, which will help improve that tax efficiency. Share plans also address the funding problem for private companies, which essentially is cash. Cash flow is tight at any stage in your business, especially if you're a startup. And if you want to attract those key players, how can you do that if you can't necessarily afford their asking price? Also, cash flow is a hot topic at the moment for anybody at any stage in business with the constraints we have with the cost of living crisis. Cash is always going to be tight. And so if there's another way of tying people in to promote growth, then that's a good thing, and a share plan can achieve that. There's also the fact that you can tie people in with certain conditions for having equity in your company, certain performance targets, and also conditions on what happens if they leave. So it's a very, very useful tool for a private company. So just an example here, a very brief one, just to show the actual effects of cash. So in April 2022, when we've just had the hike in national insurance, albeit for a small period of time, but just to show you how it looks as at today, if you're paying somebody a salary, a gross salary of 100,000 per annum, then that's actually 40% going to income tax and nearly 19% going on national insurance. So you either have to gross that up essentially to allow for that tax, or you're really not paying somebody that £100,000. So as I say there's nothing wrong with cash, but A, it comes at a high price, and B, it doesn't necessarily deliver growth because it's not providing that further incentive to go that extra step for longevity of the company. So as I've mentioned before, but it's just on this slide, and I can see one of the questions is we will provide these slides afterwards, so you will be able to have a copy of these. The employee equity can offer capital gains tax rates, and if you get it right, and that's to do with valuation essentially, which we'll move on to, there can be no income tax or national insurance. Now, no one can guarantee what's going to happen in tax rates and what government policy will be going forward. But we'd be very surprised if capital was ever more than income. As such, there'll always be a differential where you're better off on a capital gains tax net than you are in the income tax net. Now, a share plan also just gets employees thinking as shareholders. As I said, it aligns the workforce with the long-term thinking of a founder of a company or a shareholder and gets them to think that way. And that's whether it's under a share or under an option. However that tie-in is, it's towards the long-term future of the company. And typically we see that being tied to an exit. In private companies, normally the exit horizon is the period of time that the company and the shareholders are thinking about. It's not always, but that's often the case. And what type of share plan's available and what's right for you, what's right for you as a company and what's right for the individual. And that's what we're going to move on to next in a moment in terms of the alternatives to EMI. There are also current opportunities with share plans that actually make them more of interest than ever. And that's to do with the volatility in the market at the moment. We're almost in a perfect storm in 2022 where we've come out of Brexit. We're still reeling from the pandemic, and the current world political situation with the Ukraine is causing a lot of uncertainty. Now, what that does in the financial markets means that there's volatility with share prices, and that's reflected in the private company market in terms of how you value a private company share. You can't just open the FT and see what the share price is, but what you can do is you look at a tax value of the company. Now, that's not a commercial value. That's not what a third party would pay for a share in the company, but it's what the value is in the hands of the employee. And often that's at a much lower price than what the commercial value would be. And that's often to do with the restrictions on employee equity, such as it's often not transferable, and it's often forfeited, for example, if you cease employment. And factors such as COVID-19, the Ukraine, mean that we can't predict the future. And not being able to predict the future means that it's as good an argument as ever to say that the value of the shares are quite low. Now that depends on the type of plan you've got, which we're going to move into in a moment, but across all plan types, there is a real opportunity to argue a lower share price, and that means equity can get into the hands of the workforce at a lower price. Now, when EMI is not the answer. So as I said at the start of this talk, EMI is without doubt the most popular plan in the UK and arguably the most tax efficient, but it doesn't mean that it's always the answer. EMI is an option plan. Now, for some individuals, they want to be shareholders from the outset. There's a psychological element to being a shareholder. Even if that share is fairly restricted, they still see themselves as having skin in the game from the start. They've got their piece of paper, they're registered on Companies House, and they feel a part of the company. Options don't provide dividends either. So whilst something's under option under an EMI plan, there's no ability for people to take dividends out. Now, that might not necessarily be the plan of the company to start with, and not all share plans, including growth shares, do have dividends coming out of them, but it's not an option at all under an EMI plan. Probably the main barrier with EMI is its strict qualifying criteria. So whilst it's often the starting point with our clients, and we will look to see if EMI is available for them, because of the criteria, often companies don't necessarily fit into HMRC mandates. For example, people have to be employed. They can't be prospective employees. They have to be employed. And that means an employee or a director. And there's also a working time requirement around that as well, which means that you have to be full-time or at least 75% of your working time. So that would allow 1 day a week to be doing something else. But that just doesn't fit for all companies, especially startups where perhaps there is a bigger element of consultancy work going on, but a company can't afford to have people on the payroll at that stage. An EMI plan wouldn't work in those circumstances. EMI is also only for specific trading companies. And often companies dealing in land or in financial services, for example, do not qualify. The government had looked to try to extend this, but unfortunately in its spring statement, it announced that it did feel EMI was fit for purpose and wasn't looking to extend it outside the current qualifying trades. But a lot of professional service companies, finance companies and land companies just will not qualify for EMI. There's also the gross asset test and employee numbers test. So whilst these might seem like big numbers when you're at the start of the life cycle in your company, gross asset test being 30 million and the employee number being 250 on a group-wide basis, as a business grows and develops, that might well be exceeded, especially when things are looked at on a group level and a company expands to open subsidiaries and also expands overseas. That might mean that whilst they might have qualified for EMI to start with, they now don't. So there's those two elements. The company might not initially qualify for EMI at all, or it may have qualified for EMI, but it's now outgrown it. And the subsidiary point is the last point I have there, which is important. An EMI has to go in at the parent level of the group. So again, whilst the company is just one corporate body, that might not be an issue. But as you go and develop and have subsidiaries, you might want to incentivize at a subsidiary level, especially if you're carrying out different trades in different parts of the business in different companies. That can get problematic for EMI. So EMI can't go in at a subsidiary level, but other things can. And often our clients come to us with that particular scenario. I've also said there, what stage are you in the life cycle? I briefly mentioned that. As you mature, EMI, you might either have outgrown it or it might become too expensive. Whilst I mentioned before in a previous slide about valuation and the areas that might mean that a share price is lower, there's still value in that. And as a business gets bigger and has a good trading history, it's harder to argue down to very low figures. EMI has limits on it. There's an individual limit of £250,000 and an overall company limit of 3 million. Now, whilst normally at an early stage in a company and you're granting options, you're nowhere near, there's a lot of headroom in that. It can be that it could be too expensive to incentivize one senior executive and still fit within, for example, that 250 limit. And therefore, either you have to have EMI and then some form of top up, or you don't do EMI at all and you choose an alternative. I've put also about mimicking the tax efficiency of EMI. So whilst EMI is overall the most tax efficient plan, growth shares, which we're going to come on to, practically mimic EMI. You don't get the corporation tax deductions for the employer that you get with options, but otherwise it does mimic the EMI tax treatment. So it's not a bad alternative. It's not perfect for the tax, but considering all these strict qualifying criteria, it's a viable alternative for a lot of companies and is open to a lot more participants because you don't have to be an employee. Just before we move on to growth shares, I just wanted to mention non-tax advantage options because it might be a question people have. If I say, well, you can't have an EMI plan, what else can you do? You can have options that essentially have the same terms as EMI, we just don't have the tax efficiency. And I do think it's important to point out that tax efficiency isn't necessarily the most, isn't on the top of everybody's agenda. So whilst tax efficiency is a great thing to have, it's not always the main driver. And I think that's important to note because some of these plans will cost more to implement from a professional services point of view than a non-tax advantage option plan would be. So whilst you should always come and speak to us so we can tell you what the right plan is at your stage in the life cycle, it may be that tax efficiency isn't the most important driver for you at the moment in the workforce, and that a cheaper fit for purpose non-tax advantage option plan works, because 50% of something's better than 50% of nothing. So even if it's fully taxable, you're still giving a benefit and a tie-in to your workforce. So growth shares. The growth share is essentially a share in the future growth of your company. So individuals will only benefit from that future growth. It's an upfront share reward, so unlike an option, somebody is a shareholder from the outset. And as I mentioned before, there's no qualification criteria. It is open to everybody. So you can have growth shares as a founder, for example, whereas with EMI, there's a material interest test where you can't own more than 30% of the company and participate in EMI. There's no such rules with growth shares. So it can go to existing shareholders, no matter what their holding is. It can go to existing employees, non-executives, consultants, investors. It can go to anybody. What does it involve? Well, it is a new class of share in the business, because what essentially you're doing is ring fencing the current value of your company, which might be your ordinary share capital at the moment for a lot of businesses that only have one class of shares. And a new class of shares is created, which only participates in future growth. That involves changing the articles of association of the company, which we obviously do here at Gannon's, along with all the rest of the advice. And most of the rights of that share are stripped until a certain event is achieved, and that's called a hurdle, which a lot of people might have heard of. There are various different terms for it, but hurdle is the main one. And the rights are stripped generally, and we'll move on further in this presentation, and I'll explain about the different permutations of it, but generally there's no voting, no dividend rights, nothing on as or until a certain hurdle is achieved. We'll move on to the hurdles in a moment, but that right to participate in future growth will normally be over and above the current value, and then it will be linked to an exit scenario, for example, or a profit target. So as I mentioned before, valuation is key. Now, unlike with EMI, you can't agree a gross share valuation with HMRC. Due to that, the valuation has to be much more robust. So we work with specialist valuers that are active in this field who look at gross share valuations, because they're slightly more complicated than looking at the current value of the company, because you're looking at the future, and the future is hard to predict, as we've already said. Now, inevitably, that means that you often will get a much lower value, but it does mean that projections, business plans, a lot of forward thinking needs to be involved in compiling that valuation report so that there's something robust should HMRC challenge the value that has come up with. But it is important to note that broadly, there is only a 12-month challenge period from the date of the tax return submission, because when a participant gets growth shares, if they pay it will be announced on the self-assessment form, and then that gives the 12-month window for HMRC. The other key thing to note is new participants. So if you're looking to implement some growth shares now and then maybe some more in 12 months' time, a new valuation will need to be done each time somebody new comes in, because a new class of share will need to be created. And that's because you're ring fencing the current value of the company each time a participant comes in. So if somebody comes in 2022, you look at the current value now. If somebody comes in 2023, hopefully the business will have grown in that year, which means there'll be a new starting point for the future growth. Now, once the valuation has come up with, that will be the price set for that growth share. If that price is paid, then there won't be any tax, there won't be any income tax or national insurance. If the growth share is gifted or given us a discount to that value, then that will lead to a tax liability. And we're going to go through that on some slides moving forward now to help explain that in a practical way. But once the growth share is acquired, all gains on it will be subject to capital. And that's the same as once you've got your EMI option, or the growth is subject to capital. So we are in essence trying to do the same thing. The one point to note is that the capital gains tax rate is likely to be 20%, not 10%, which is business asset disposal relief, BADR. Now with EMI, you nearly always qualify for BADR. The rules are slightly more complex with growth shares. It means it's more likely to be 20%. But 20% is still a very good deal compared to what it would be without this sort of arrangement, for example, under a non-tax advantage option, where it would be fully subject to income tax and national insurance, both for the employee and the employer. So I just wanted to run through an example of a normal share reward versus a growth share reward, just to give an idea of the numbers that we're talking about. So a typical scenario will be that an employer wants to incentivize a key member of staff with some shares. So here we have employee A being incentivized with 10% of the employer. So the shares are worth £100 each. That's based on the last investor round, and that's often a benchmark that HMRC or valuers will use if there has been a recent investment. And there are 100,000 shares in issue. And as I said, you will get copies of these slides, so don't worry about scribbling down madly. And a company value is roughly 10 million in those circumstances. That means a 10% holding will equal 10,000 shares. Now, if you do the maths on that, when we've said that the company is worth, if we go back, 10 million, that would be £1 million to pay if the shares were to be fully paid for, or the individual would have to pay income tax and possibly national insurance, but most likely income tax on that 1 million. So say roughly 400,000. Now that's a very unattractive proposition for an employee. It's one thing for an investor to come in or a founder, but for an employee that may not stay on with the company, doesn't have necessarily the same cash flow or same projections as initial founders and investors, it's a real commercial risk for them because they have to pay upfront for the award, but there's no guarantee that the share will hold its value. It could go underwater, as we call it. It could lose value and be worth less than they paid for. And also in a private company, there's no liquidity event necessarily. There's the exit that can be on the horizon, or there is the ability to create some form of internal market through an employee benefit trust, for example. But generally, people are waiting for that exit, be it a trade sale, a share sale, or an IPO. It's a lot of money to pay to have that uncertainty about how the money will actually come out in the end. If we contrast that with growth shares, and on a rough basis, and it shows you the discounts that you can get on a growth share, moving from £100 a share, it could be say down to £1 a share. That's not an official valuation. This is an example for illustrative purposes only, but that can show the discounts potentially available. That would mean there's only £10,000 to pay, or again, the tax on it. Companies may well prefer for people to fully pay up for the value of the shares, but as long as the individual has paid at least the tax on it, then that's still considered fine moving forward to get into capital gains. So you always need to think what's the full value of those shares, or what's the tax on it. Either or is acceptable. Obviously the company will get more money into it if the individual's paid up the full amount of cash. But if we can see there, that's a difference between 1 million or 10,000, and that's quite a big difference. The difference for the individual is that we've essentially said there's a hurdle here, and that they'll only participate going forwards once the ordinary shareholders get that £100 a share back. That in essence is a hurdle in itself. It's ring fencing the current value of the company, where we've said it's worth £100 a share. And then anything on top of that will be shared pro rata. So that's a very basic example of the difference between an ordinary share and a growth share. So we talked about hurdles a little bit. I just want to go into a bit more depth. So A hurdle can be set at any level, and it could be at the current value, like we've just shown in that previous example, or normally it's set at a bit of a premium above the market value. The higher the hurdle is set, the lower the upfront value normally is to participants, and the growth share specialist valuers will look at hurdles and look at the remoteness, the chance of the hurdle being met, and work out what the value of the share will be. Now, companies do have to be careful not to set a hurdle that is too distant, because it does need to act as an incentive. So whilst setting a hurdle, say the company's worth 1 million now, you hope to sell it 6 million, and you set a hurdle at 10 million, so people share in the proceeds above the 6. If it gets too remote, there's less of a chance that people are going to see that as being hit. So whilst it might be a very low upfront value, the incentive isn't really there. But the key to all this is preserving the existing value for existing shareholders, and their initial current value investment is not diluted. And that's of real importance to a lot of obviously founders and early stage investors. I've just been asked a question about, can you issue nil paid growth shares? Yes, you can, and we are going to move on to that. So hopefully your question is answered, Derek, further on in my slides, but if not, I can answer that for you further if you don't feel it's full enough explanation. So I'm just going to give a hurdle example here. So the company value is 10 million, 10% are under growth shares, and the growth share valuation is £1. So that's the same as the example we had before, that the individual either pays £10,000 up front to fully acquire the growth shares, or they pay the tax on that, which is also acceptable. And the tax would be income tax, and that would be through self-assessment. So for example, if it's a higher rate taxpayer, that's 40%. So they're paying 4,000 on that. A hurdle set at 12 million. So the company value is at 10, and we've added that premium. We've got a £2 million premium on it, and the hurdle set at 12. The company then sells for 15. The growth shareholders are sharing in the value above that hurdle, i.e. that 3 million, the difference between 15 and 12. And 10% were under growth shares. So if we do the maths, 10% of 3 million is 300,000. And then that 300,000 would be at the 20% capital gains tax rate. That means that they'll get 240,000 in their pocket from an initial investment of either 10,000 or the tax on 10,000. So that's a pretty good deal for the individuals. I just quickly want to look at the documents involved with growth shares. So when it gets we're drafting these. The main, other than the valuation, the main things to think about are your articles of association will need to change because you're issuing a new class of share. And that also the articles need to be changed to allow for employee shareholders with that new class, such as what happens if they leave. And we are going to go on to leaver provisions towards the end of the seminar, but that all needs to be written into the articles to allow it. There's also subscription agreements. So individuals will sign up with the company. This is what's actually signed between the two. They'll sign the subscription agreement. There's also something called a Section 431 tax election. That ensures that the gains going forward are subject to capital and not income. Essentially, the individual elects up front to say, I'm declaring that I have paid the full tax market value, i.e. that £10,000 that we were talking about before. And then there are various board minutes and shareholder resolutions. I've just been asked a question just before, because we're moving to a JSOP after this, that if subscribers only pay the tax up front, do they need to pay the share price later? No, if they pay the tax up front, then that's considered payment. So the way that the employment related securities legislation works is that to the extent an individual doesn't pay the tax market value for shares, and the tax market value being that value in the individual's hands, not a commercial value to a third party, to the extent they don't pay that full value, they pay tax on the difference between what they pay, if anything, and that value. So it would just be the difference in the tax. Kathy's asked, can the company loan the tax payment to the employee? Yes, they can, Kathy, and that's going to come on in our section on funding. But essentially, there can be employer loans to individuals to pay that tax element, and especially if that's under £10,000, that can be done. That can be done very effectively. But that we'll come on to that in our funding section. Mike's asked, am I going to talk about setting up mechanisms to realise value and sell the shares in the absence of company sale? Yes, I'm going to mention that as well, Mike, in the funding section. And that's essentially setting up some sort of internal market. So let's move on now to JSOPs. So JSOP is a joint share ownership plan. Now, essentially, these work very similarly to growth shares in that the main aim is that future growth goes to individuals, and that they move away from the income tax net to the capital gains tax net. The key difference here is you don't need to create a new class. Now, this is important for some companies. Some investors, especially corporate investors, if a company is a bit further on in its life cycle, do not like new classes being created. And so a JSOP means that you can still look at that future element within your ordinary share capital. So how does it work? The share is essentially divided up. It's held jointly with a trustee. So there is that extra complexity with having a trust involved, but essentially for each share, they're divided. The employee holds an interest and the trust holds an interest. The trust holds the interest generally over the current value of the share, and they also hold the legal right to the share, and then the beneficial interest is split, and that future value is in the hands of the employee. Like a growth share, this produces low values in the hands of employees because we're just looking at the future. The current value is held by that trust. That lowers what that future portion is worth in the hands of the individual it's being given to. So for these reasons, the JSOP interest will be very low, just like the growth share. So as I said, it's similar to the growth shares on the valuation and on the tax. The documentation is slightly different. You have a co-ownership agreement because you're owning it with a trust. And essentially what the aim is that there'll be a call option from the trustee to eventually allow the employee to retain the share once it's fully vested. And when I talk about vesting, that can be quite similar to what we're talking about with a hurdle. It could be on an exit event where a company would sell for over X. So the JSOP in essence, and we do just have one slide on JSOPs because a lot of what I've spoken about with the tax is the same as with the growth share, but the fundamental difference is that you have a trust involved and you're splitting the ownership of this share. So it does seem it is more complex, but not unduly so than a growth share. But where it really works and where you really need to think about it is if you don't want to create that new class in your company to have the growth share. And that often works but that's often very important to AIM-listed companies or companies that are looking to list, or if the current investor base doesn't want the articles changed to have a new share class. Just conscious of time, so we're going to move on to funding. So as I've said, growth shares and JSOP, they significantly reduce the upfront cost of getting a real stake in a business, but that stake is still worth something. Now, you can either pay the value, as we've looked at, or you can pay the tax on the value. How can that be funded? Well, one way is the employer loan. The employer loan if it's under £10,000, and if we look back at some of our examples, when it was just a tax, often that was under, in my example, it was under 10,000, then that can be done completely tax-free. If that's written off at some point, that's a different case study. But so long as you can provide under £10,000, then generally there won't be any tax associated with that. And it's quite a simple way for an employer to loan the money to pay the tax for the individual to acquire the share. Now, if it's over £10,000, then as long as again, it can be quite simple and quite effective to still provide a cheap loan to an employee. You've got to bear in mind the official rate of interest. And as long as the arrangements have at an interest rate no less than the current official rate, which is 2%, then the loans can be made. As I said, there are some quirks with if the loan is written off, and also if the loan's made to a director rather than an employee, that's got some other associations with it. And we often have to look at the makeup of the company itself and its size, because there can be other tax considerations. But just very generally, think about, is it under £10,000? Well, then that should be fine. If it's not, I'm going to get some kind of loan arrangement agreement drawn up, and that's something that we look at Gannon's as well, and make sure that the interest rate is set right. And then generally, as long as it's repayable, then it's an effective way of assisting individuals to acquire growth shares or JSOPs. I've just seen there's a question about JSOPs to employees only. No, in fact, all the arrangements, growth shares or JSOPs, they do not have to be to employees. They can be to non-employees as well. So I wanted to move on to an alternative with funding. This was a question that came up earlier about nil paid shares. So an alternative to providing growth shares or ordinary shares, sorry, growth shares or JSOP, would be to provide nil or partly paid shares. These are over ordinary shares with full rights. So you've got piece of ordinary share capital, fully voting, fully dividend, fully participating. But the cost of that, and if we remind ourselves of an earlier slide, was say £100, that in that example was the £1 million that would have been for somebody to pay, or the tax on that. Now, if the tax on a £1 million, which obviously is a lot of money, is too much, which it probably would be for nearly all employees, or too much of a risk, then you can issue shares nil paid. And essentially, it's an IOU to the company. It's permissible under company law, so long as the nominal value is paid up. So that could be, the shares are a penny face value or a pound or whatever they are. So long as that's paid up, you can go into the articles of association of the company. And for example, we do this for our clients at Gannon's, and we'll put in a mechanism in there whereby an individual can take the value of those shares now, but there's a call on them at a later date, and that call is for the full value, not the tax. So whereas if in our £1 million example, if you had the individual who said, well, I can't pay the tax on 1 million and I can't pay the million, I'll do a nil paid share, I'll take the value of that 1 million now, but it's all repayable. The full call's repayable in certain events. Now, normally and hopefully that would be on an exit of the company. So when the company's sold, and at that point you'll get your sale proceeds and it will nicely be netted out, and you'll just get your lump sum less the call, that £1 million, for example. But you have to be, individuals have to be wary of the fact that the call can come in other circumstances. One of those circumstances would be if they left employment, and another would be a liquidation of the company. So whereas for a founder, and again, nil paid shares are available to all, not just employees, whereas for a founder, that call might be considered more of something that they'd be more prepared to put up with, because there's no chance of them leaving their own company. For an employee, it's still a big undertaking where they could cease employment, and then that full call would be due on them. So it's, as with a loss of share plan design, you have to look at the individual that you're trying to incentivize as well, because there's no one size fits all. I mentioned partly paid because you could choose to not pay anything up other than the nominal value, or you could choose to pay part of it. This mechanism would work with both. This alternative to having gross shares or JSOP does still require looking at the values. As I said, it can be quite an onerous undertaking, but it can work very well, and it's worked very well for some of our clients that are looking to have people share in the full capital of their company now, not just future growth. So I wanted to move on to a case study. And this is based on a client that we've been advising recently, whereby a few of the types of share plan that we've mentioned before come into play, specifically the nil paid and growth shares. So our client was the owner of a professional services company, which you'll remember does not qualify for EMI. It's not a qualifying trade. And they're looking to motivate their key staff for an eventual sale in 4 to 5 years' time. The business is currently worth 2 million. And they wanted to put in an exit hurdle of 5 million, as in they wouldn't consider a sale of the company below 5 million. So they felt that that was a good hurdle to ask individuals to achieve in order for them to be incentivized for that growth. So currently there were 1 million shares in issue. The valuation was 10p per growth share, but £1 for an ordinary share. So that, again, this is illustrative purposes and being slightly changed the purposes of the webinar, but that shows essentially around a 90% discount for having just a share in the growth as opposed to the share in the ordinary share capital. We spoke about 4 alternative methods to deliver the shares that our client wanted to vest on an exit. And I've put these down in front of you here. So there were growth shares with no rights. Those are your typical type of growth shares where until a hurdle is hit, there is no voting, no dividends, nothing. Stripped right back essentially until that hurdle is achieved. And then the next alternative were growth shares with full rights. The client wanted to know, well, actually, we do just want these individuals to share in the future growth, but we want them to have voting and dividend rights. We want them to be able to take some money out as dividends, because dividend tax is still cheaper than income tax, and therefore that was another mechanism how they wanted the individuals to be paid. We then also looked at the alternative of, okay, if you do you want the individuals to actually share in the current value, full rights, current value, not just growth, and looking at that maybe through an employer loan. And then the final scenario was nil paid shares. So this is just to give you a brief idea, and as I said, the slides will be available on a link that will be passed to you by email after this webinar to everybody that registered. But again, for illustrative purposes, if we look at growth shares with no rights, so these are your typical growth shares. We've got a subscription price of 10p, which is what we said the growth share valuation was, and 150,000 shares would be 10%, would be 15% of that company. That's £15,000. Now you remember I said you either pay the subscription price or the tax on the difference, and that tax would be £6,000. In that scenario, an employer could loan that money, and it's under the 10,000 de minimis, which means that could be done. The loan can be made tax-free. As I said, there can be there can be some tax if loans are written off in the future, and that's a different topic. But just assuming there's a simple loan in place and it's under £10,000, then essentially that growth share could be given free as such at the moment to that employee without them having to put their hands in their pockets. So the next scenario is growth shares with full rights. Now here the subscription price is going to be higher because part of the depression of the value of that growth share in the individual's hands was that it was stripped of most of its rights as or until a hurdle is met. But we are still dealing with future growth, and we are still dealing with an uncertain future. And for those reasons, the subscription price will be higher. And again, this is for illustrative purposes, but higher maybe say to 25p rather than 10p. So still something potentially attainable. And in that scenario, the same number of shares, well, that would be £37,500 to subscribe for. Or, as we said, the tax on that is also sufficient for HMRC purposes. And in that scenario, the tax would be £15,000. So you could do the part employer loan you could do the £10,000 potentially on employer loan, and they could pay the rest of it, or the whole thing could come into a employer loan. But in those circumstances, we'd have to look at the official rate of interest and other things like that. But it could be part financed by them and part financed by an employer loan. And in that way, 5,000 from them and 10,000 from under the employer loan could work well for them. So the next one is ordinary shares with full rights. So this is where we're not going down the growth share route, we're not going down an ill-paid route, this is what the full cost to acquire the shares. The full cost to acquire the shares would be £150,000, which is a lot of money, or the tax on it is still a lot of money, it's £60,000. There could be an arrangement with an employer loan. It wouldn't be in the de minimis, and so interest rates and various other things would have to be looked at. There might be still a small tax charge annually to the individual and to the employer. Or it could be that once, which is what happened with our client, once they saw that, they were like, actually, that's not tenable. We want to go down either giving growth shares, or we want to do the nil paid route, which is the next one, which would be that whole 150,000 would be due in certain events, but they could be issued now fully paid with the call on for the 150,000, and that means that only nominal value would need to be paid now. So there's a lot of things to think about with those case studies and with what we've spoken about, and one of the main considerations, I suppose, is there's no one size fits all. I did want to come back to one of the questions that was asked about if there is no exit, and how that could work. And that will tie in slightly with my last slide on levers. So generally share plans look at good lever, bad lever. If somebody leaves a company, if it's for a good reason, which may be ill health or retirement, or bad reason being that they've committed gross misconduct or they've gone to a competitor, you want to get the shares back off them. Now, if in a private company that's not liquid, there's only two ways really that shares can be bought back. And this doesn't just apply to leavers, it could also apply to existing shareholders that want to realise some liquidity in their shares because there hasn't been an exit. And that's why I've tied it into the question that was asked earlier. You can have a company buyback. Company buybacks are something that we do here at Gannon's as well with our corporate department. Companies can buy back shares off existing shareholders or people under an employee share plan of some sort, and those shares are then cancelled. That means there's an uplift to everybody else. There are certain rules around company buybacks, like how, for example, how long somebody's held a share. But one of the other considerations is what value to buy it back at. So typically a bad leaver, we might say, will buy back at cost, i.e. what it cost you to get the share, which often isn't very much under an employee share plan. If they're a good leaver, we might say it will be fair value at that time and another valuation will have to be done. But who buys the shares? So I've talked about the company buyback, but the other main mechanism for private companies is some sort of trust. So an EBT. So if you had a JSOT, for example, you'd have had to put in a trustee. That trust can be used as a warehouse for much wider range of circumstances than just having the JSOT, or you could just put in an EBT anyway. The EBT acts as a third-party shareholder, and they can buy and sell shares and award shares under different share plans on behalf of the company. The advantage of that is it's a third-party exit. It is an exit route without there having to be a sale of the company. And it's one where the shares can be held and recycled, whereas typically company share buybacks, the shares have to be cancelled. But valuation is key with levers, and it all has to be looked at. And any kind of share plan that involves shares rather than options, we do have to go into the Articles of Association to make sure that levers are dealt with carefully. And levers are normally one of the main questions that we're asked about with clients, either if clients are coming to us with an existing plan, or an individual, a senior executive, might come to us and say, I need to understand how this plan works for me, what it means. One of the main questions we're nearly always asked is, what does it mean if I leave the company? Or for the company, how does this affect the company? What price do we have to pay? What rights do they have? What rights do we have? So that's the end of the presentation. I can see that I've been asked a few questions and I've got a few minutes. I would like to say that any questions that I don't get to answer here, we've got a note of them and I will come back to you individually and answer your questions. So we've got Joe saying, who owns the trustee beneficial in the JSOT? Well, the trustee does. So often that's a corporate trustee. They're offshore for tax reasons normally. So they might be established in the Channel Islands. It's quite common for UK companies to have a Channel Islands trustee. And they're corporate trustees that will sit there and maintain that interest. Having a trust is something that has to be considered carefully by a company. They are independent trustees. Directors can't be seen to fetter their discretion. So they do have to act independently and they are there for the benefit of the employees rather than the company. So that relationship dynamic needs to be considered, but they can work very, very well for private companies, and they do provide that third-party exit that wouldn't be there if there wasn't a sale of some other sort. I've just been asked as well, can nil-paid shares be cancelled if an employee leaves and doesn't want to pay the call? Well, that's an interesting one, Joe. Essentially, the call is there, so it is a risk that employees are taking. There might be some corporate aspects to that I can come back to you on separately, but just on a wider point of view, anytime an employee takes equity, they really do have to be cognizant of the fact that it's something that they have to pay for now, and there's no guarantee that it will have value in the future. And so it's not something to be undertaken lightly if there's a big call lying over someone's head, like there are with nil-paid shares, which is why maybe for a lot of employees a growth share is a more attractive proposition, because they're getting something at very little upfront cost and it's all to gain rather than to lose. So the nil-paid share route, it's there and it's important, but it will only work in specific circumstances for specific people, and it wouldn't be something that we would generally recommend for the run-of-the-mill everyday employee, because it is a large undertaking with a risk attached to it, that the money might all be called in and the employee's not there anymore, or they can't afford it, etc. So it is a gamble. As always, I've literally just run up right to right to the core. We've got 1 minute to go. So I just want to thank everybody for joining this morning. I'd also ask if you could click the feedback button. I think if when you exit the webinar, there should be a feedback button. We'd be very grateful for any feedback you might have. And we will be sending a link out after this webinar to everyone who registered. So you'll be able to see a copy of the presentation and the slides. Thank you very much for joining this morning. Bye-bye.